Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Alberg, and I'm so glad you're joining us for the fifth in our six-part webinar series on farming and insect life. Today we're doing prairie strips benefit to pollinators and farmers, and we're very fortunate to have three speakers from the Iowa State University to speak about the strips option as a way of improving conservation on your farm. We have Dr. Matt O'Neill, Tim Youngquist, and Omar de Koch Mercado, and we're very grateful for them for joining us. As you probably know, we're doing this series and other education work to sort of better enable farmers and landowners to have good stewardship on the land that's going to benefit the farmer and the land that we share the world with. We are in particular marketing this towards farmland owners. 60% of Illinois farmland is owned by someone who doesn't actually farm it. And so we believe that they are part of the stewardship picture of how we do agriculture in Illinois and in the Midwest in general. And so we believe it's really important to engage farmland owners in this work. As brief background, again, my name is Nathan Alberg. I'm with the Liberty Prairie Foundation. We're a nonprofit in Grays Lake, Illinois, in the Prairie Crossing Conservation Community. We own and manage a 94-acre organic farm, which we use for a number of programs that demonstrate, promote, and support sustainable agriculture. My particular aspect of this work is running the Northeast Illinois Farm Link program. That's a program that links landowners and farmers, helps them work out good land access agreements that will give the farmer and the landowner a chance to do really good stewardship on their land. You can find us at illinoisfarmlink.org. I also want to give a shout out to our funder and underwriter, Food Land Opportunity, localizing the Chicago Food Shed. This is a cooperative funding initiative of the Chicago Community Trust and the Kinship Foundation. The goal of this multi-year initiative is to bring about a local resilient food economy that protects and conserves land and other natural resources. They've been incredibly generous to us and many other good groups in the Chicago area, and so we're grateful, very grateful to them. A few words about how we do today's thing. It is being recorded. We have a YouTube channel that you can find if you just go to YouTube and look for Liberty Prairie Foundation. We are going to be taking questions through the chat function. If you look at the very bottom of your screen in the middle, it has chat. There's a little one there, I believe. If you press on that, you'll see a little field where you can put a question into, and I'll moderate those after each of our presenters does their presentation. We are going to have you muted. We'd actually like to have you also mute your video until at the very end, so our presenters can then see you. The idea is to preserve as much bandwidth as possible for the presentation. Speaking of landowners, we want to give a shout out as well to the McHenry County Conservation District. They have been our thought partner in developing this series. They are a very pioneering conservation district. They have 6,000 acres of farmland, and they're doing some really thoughtful work about how they develop a management system for their 6,000 acres of farmland that will sort of be in keeping with their principles of conservation, while also engaging thoughtfully with their farmer partners. And so we've been really honored to have the chance to work with them on some projects along those lines. It was in fact Ed Collins, the Director of Natural Resources at the district, who was sort of really helpful in sort of identifying, along with his team, the idea that we should get landowners and farmers more information about how insects relate to farming. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot of news about the insect apocalypse. And in general, if you know about conservation, you know that insects are a big part of the food web, so they really matter. I think it's very possible that some people might think, well, insects and farming, that seems like kind of a niche peripheral topic, but I don't think it is. I think, number one, if we want to be generous towards the rest of life on this planet, we want to share the planet as much as possible. And then number two, from regenerative farming, we're really learning that the more you enable life, whether it's soil life or other life, to prosper, that creates healthier soil, healthier food, more resilient farm, and more profitable farms that don't have to rely on inputs. So the degree to which we have diverse insect life in a way is an indicator of how resilient and sound your farm is. And so that's a kind of a completely different way of thinking about that. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that as we get into prairie strips, is that all of our presentations to this point have kind of talked about whether it's multi-species, cover crops, integrated pest management, regenerative practices, have all kind of assumed that the land that you have in production should stay in production. You're just going to play with how that particular farmland is managed. And I think there's a good reason to think about this like the renovation of a house. When you renovate a house, you don't necessarily assume that you're going to sort of use every room the way it's always been used. You're sort of open to new possibilities that might maximize the use of that house. And I think prairie strips are sort of an example of that in the farming world, where you rethink all of your assumptions about your land, and maybe there's a different way of using some of the land that might in the big picture be really good. So again, we're about to get started with Dr. Matt O'Neill, and through Matt, Tim, and Omar, we're going to get a sense of what are the benefits of prairie strips, what exactly they are, how to implement them, and how to get some funding to help defray the costs. I want to introduce Matt. He's a professor of entomology at Iowa State University and the strips pollinator research lead. He has a research and teaching appointment at Iowa State University where he focuses on the ecology of insects, exploring ways to conserve beneficial insects and manage pests that attack corn and soybeans. He's a creative, energetic, enthusiastic presenter. I just learned he's also a podcaster. So you're going to enjoy his beautiful voice. And Matt, I'm really glad that you're going to take it from here.
Thank you, Nathan. And thanks to you and the Liberty Prairie Foundation for inviting me and Omar and Tim as representatives of the Prairie Strips Project at Iowa State University. This project is one that can help farmers and landowners achieve conservation goals. And today I'm going to talk specifically about how the Prairie Strips practice can benefit landowners who want to improve the pollinator community in their farm. Just a little housekeeping. I'm about to share the screen. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go to my slide set. And how's that look? So far, so good?
Not seeing anything.
Okay, let me go to share screen. It says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
All right. Try it now.
All right, so I'm going to hit share screen, desktop. All right, and how about now?
Bingo, very good.
Okay, that's the first slide. Okay, so as a recovering extrovert who is very excited to talk to someone other than his kids who are done listening to him, I'd like to just talk a little bit about myself and how I came to this topic. I was hired by Iowa State University about 16 years ago as the soybean entomologist in response to an outbreak of the soybean aphid. You can see here in this picture, this is an invasive pest that has really fundamentally changed how we grow soybeans across a big part of the Midwest, because it now involves using insecticides, both seed treatments, as you can see here in this image, and then foliar applications either by plane or by tractor. And early in my career, we focused on the best ways to use these products to help farmers achieve optimal yield. And in that process, we discovered that in soybean fields, there are a remarkable community of beneficial insects, specifically natural enemies, predators, parasites, parasitoids, more specifically, that attack the soybean aphid. And these are beneficial insects that we're trying to conserve and utilize to help manage the soybean aphid. But the other thing that we saw when we were out in these fields for hours over the course of the season was that they harbored pollinators, specifically this honeybee visiting a soybean flower, but others as well. And I got to work with a group of students who were very interested in this and were curious about what community of bees were found in corn and soybean fields, especially given that neither of those crops require pollination to set yield. So despite a fundamental change in insecticide use in soybeans, both pollinators persist in both Iowa corn and soybean fields. And this is some work that we've published. And Nathan, I've made this available to your members if they want to read in more detail. But we were shocked to find almost 50 species of pollinators in corn and soybean fields. A good chunk of them were what we might call sweat bees, members of the Lasioglossum genus is depicted here. We also found really beautiful halictids, these metallic bees, like this specific species, Agapostomons virescens, and then some larger ones that kind of look like honeybees, but these are solitary native bees, Melissoides algillus and Melissoides bimaculata. And then we also found other pollinators that aren't bees, syrphid flies. The adult syrphid, as you can see here, kind of looks like a bee. It feeds on flowers, it can do some pollination, but its larval stage is a voracious predator of aphids. And you might ask, well, what about honeybees? Well, in the fields that we were doing these studies, beekeepers weren't keeping hives near them. So we found very few, if any, honeybees in that community. And you might say, well, if there's this somewhat robust community, even when feral, non-kept honeybees aren't around, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that historically, we're seeing declines in wild bee abundance in the United States. A paper published a few years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science modeled how land use was affecting the abundance of wild bees. And in this figure, the color indicates how abundance has changed over about a 7-year period. And for places like Iowa and Illinois, there's been a decline in abundance. And not only is abundance in decline, but also diversity. And many ecologists have noted that some species that were quite abundant in the past are now very difficult to find if present at all. And this has resulted in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designating several bee species to be added to the endangered species list. Most recently in 2017, the rusty patch bumblebee was added. And this is a bee that used to be found around the Midwest, including Iowa and Illinois, and it's now restricted to about 20% of its original range, which resulted in it being added to the endangered species list. Honeybees are also experiencing this stress. Beekeepers are surveyed by the Bee Informed Partnership Program every year, reporting how many of the bees they lose during the winter that don't survive the winter. And the most recent published report of the survey is available on their website and is also available in a peer-reviewed publication. And you can see for Iowa and Illinois, it's about 38 to 37% of the honeybees hives going into the winter do not survive. And this is worrisome because it makes beekeeping harder. Most beekeepers expect to see some loss, but they report a sustainable loss of about 10%. Above that, it bites into their profit and their ability to, one, have enough bees to produce honey, but also have enough bees to provide farms that need those bees for crop pollination. And in general, scientists, ecologists, entomologists like myself have adopted a hypothesis that's summarized in this paper that was published in Science in 2015, that bee declines are due to 3 stressors: parasites, pesticides, and a lack of flowers. So parasites can be things like varroa mites that attack honeybees, pathogens like the viruses that they may transmit back and forth. And then insecticides are things, or pesticides are things like the insecticides we use on crops, also fungicides, and especially neonicotinoid applied seed treatments. But maybe fundamental to all of this is a lack of floral resources, a lack of flowers. And that is especially true for other pollinators like the monarch. Monarch, as you know, it requires milkweed to complete its life cycle. And milkweed abundance has declined. And we've seen in the overwintering sites in Mexico where the monarchs in North America gather before starting their migration in the spring, their overwintering populations have declined dramatically. This is data from the Monarch Watch organization. And if you summarize the 90s to early 2000s, there was an average hectare of overwintering sites for the monarch that was about 11.12 hectares. But starting around turn of the century there, that has declined by about half. And it's projected that if these declines continue, we may lose the monarch in large parts of North America, in part because of a lack of forage or a lack of the plant that it needs to complete its life cycle. This phenomenon has been noted both by scientists, but also the general public. In an article published in the Minnesota Star Tribune, the reporter notes in the title, "Fields of Green, a Desert for Bees." And they notice that this green desert is contributing to a lack of pollinators. And what do they mean by that? Well, most of the Midwest, especially Iowa and Illinois, are used for agriculture. This is data from the USDA showing by county how much of the land is in use for agriculture. In our part of the world, that's mostly corn and soybeans. In Iowa, as a state, it's about 86%. Maybe Illinois is not as great, but you can see there are counties in Illinois that are up to 90% committed to corn and soybeans. And this is great in terms of being a very productive use of the land. We grow food that supplies much of the nation, if not the world. And our farmers are very good at producing large yields on that land. Unfortunately, in the process of doing so, they reduce a lot of the biodiversity in the landscape, removing a lot of the plants that would have been hosts for our native pollinators. So then the question is there a solution? Is there some way that we can work against this? And we might look back to the United States before European settlers arrived. And before European settlers arrived, much of this landscape was covered in prairie. And prairie is a mixture of not just grasses, but perennial flowering forbs. As you can see in this picture, a sprinkling of those. And a group of entomologists at Michigan State University over a decade ago took individual plants found in prairies, these flowering plants, and surveyed the insects that were attracted to them. And they did this in a paper that was published in Environmental Entomology, again, about a decade ago. And what was really interesting in that is when they summarized their best mix, those plants, like say wild strawberry, golden Alexanders, you see the list here, and they took out the ones that were most attractive to natural enemies, things like lady beetles and bees, and they evaluated them based on how many species of each of these categories they found. When they took the plant species and they organized it by bloom period, they created what I like to call a 24/7 summer-long buffet of flowers. And this is helpful because this tells us that within prairie, there's this resource, this summer-long resource that could be made available to pollinators such that throughout the summer, they would have some resources to feed on. And some of these, and this is not all of the flowering plants that could be found. This is just the best bet, those that were most attractive. So there's the potential to provide a really valuable resource if we reintroduce these plants back into our landscape. So then the question is, where can we practice production and conservation at the same time? And that question is fundamental to what we call the STRIPS project at Iowa State University. STRIPS is an acronym for Science-Based Trials of Row Crops with Prairie Strips. And it's a project that has been going on for over a decade now. That's our logo. And it includes multiple scientists from multiple disciplines, from entomologists like me to ecologists like Lisa Schulte-Moore, agronomists like Mike Castellano and Matt Liebman, and economists like John Tyndall, and a variety of students, extension folk, and now collaborators from around the region who have contributed their time, their resources, their money, to explore how we can counter some of the environmental issues facing agriculture. And one of the biggest ones that started this project off was what you see here. And for most, and this is a common sight for most of the Midwest, when 8 months out of the year, the ground is bare as a function of growing annual crops. And that ground is at risk for erosion, especially with significant rain events as we're experiencing now as the climate is changing. And those rain events can carry off the soil as well as nutrients that are added to the field in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus, which is a problem when it comes to dealing with water quality and the issues of anoxic zones at the bases of watersheds, most substantially the Mississippi watershed. So this group got together about 15 years ago to start what we call phase one, a research and demonstration of the principle of prairie strips on small experimental watersheds. This was done at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, which is just outside of Des Moines. It's the largest reconstructed prairie in North America. Last time I checked, I think it was a little bit over 5,000 acres. And they set aside a little bit of land for us to do our experiment. And you might ask, well, why prairie? Well, with regards to annual crops, prairie is a contrast. It's perennial. It's there throughout the year. Its roots, even if it doesn't look like much above ground, its roots are deep, going several feet into the soil. And that's essential if we want to trap nutrients and sediment as they move down a watershed. Above ground, especially late in the year, like what we're seeing right now, are stiff stems that can stay erect in a pounding rain and provide a barrier to soil erosion and nutrient loss. And hopefully, as you've seen from the pictures, prairie is diverse. It's a community of plants that have coexisted together, and they're native. And if we're trying to conserve native insects, we want to provide them the plants that they've co-evolved with in order to give them the best chance we can. So this is what phase one looked like. These were experimental watersheds where we put small amounts of prairie back into a landscape. And we compared these to watersheds that were committed solely to corn and soybeans. This is an example of prairie strips on 10% of a watershed, both at the base and then in strips going up the watershed. And you might see this little white spot right here. This is a funnel. And thanks to GIS technology, our engineers, like Matt Helmers, were able to determine where the water would meet as it comes off of that watershed and collect it in a funnel like this, where they could measure the flow of water, the amount of sediment lost, and the nutrients moving in that sediment and water. And a lot of this has been published in peer-reviewed journals, and there's data and figures showing the results of what happens when you put prairie strips in. I'm going to show you a picture of this after a 4-inch rain event that occurred, I think around late July, early August. So this is from one of our controls. This is a watershed that was committed solely to corn and soybean production. And this year it was corn. And I should point out, this was corn grown on the contour with reduced / no-till practices. Quite a substantial amount of sediment moving off of that field. We had another control, which was all prairie. Same day, same rain event, kind of night and day difference. Now, we can't go back to this. We can't go back to all of Iowa and Illinois being covered in prairie. We need to practice high production agriculture in order to deal with the growing human population. But this is what that funnel looks like if 10% of that prairie was added back to that watershed. There's still some erosion, but it's a substantial reduction from a watershed that was totally committed to corn. This is a 90% reduction in sediment and an 80 to 86% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus moving through that landscape. In addition, when we sampled the insect community in these watersheds, we found an increase in insect species richness, so the number of species in watersheds that had the prairie strips. Specifically, we found over 2 times more natural enemies, so lady beetles that would feed on, say, soybean aphids or other insect pests. And we found 3.5 times more pollinators, both bees and butterflies, in those fields that had the prairie strips. So all of this has been summarized in a paper that came out in 2018 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I've sent a link so you could read these if you want to read more about the benefits that accrue from prairie strips and some of the costs, because you're taking some land out of production. All those details can be found in this paper. But now you might ask, well, how good is that solution that was done on those experimental watersheds in an on-farm commercial setting? So the last 3 years, we've looked at farms where farmers have put in prairie strips like the one you see here, and we've compared them to control sites that were growing the same crop nearby, but didn't have a prairie strip, but did have a road edge or a grass waterway. So we're contrasting the high diversity seed mix of the prairie strips with these road ditches and grass waterways. And I got to work with a group of really remarkable students, Caroline Murray and Ge Zhang, who looked at the plant community and the pollinator community in these fields, specifically honeybees. And I'll talk more about this 3-year study that just came to an end last year. So first off, as my teenage daughter says, kind of no duh, there were more blooming flowers in farms with the prairie strips than without. And this is really noticeable in mid-September when pretty much those grass waterways and road edges lacked flowers, but we saw thousands in the prairie strips. At least 3 orders of magnitude difference here. That's really remarkable. We also saw a greater diversity of plants. So when Caroline went out to survey the plant community, not only was she counting flowers, but she was counting what types of plants were producing those flowers. And pretty much from the start throughout the year, we were finding more plant species that flower at prairie strips than control. There were some at the control, but not nearly as many at the strip sites. Specifically, one that we were interested in was milkweed, and this was a little bit of a surprise to us. We saw more milkweed at control sites overall than at strip sites. And Caroline kind of scratched her head about this, and I had to remind her, it is a weed. You know, it will show up in places that we didn't plant it. And in those grass waterways or road edges, it doesn't have a lot to compete against. But in a strip site, there are 30 to 40 species it has to work against. And she noted that in those control sites, even though there were more stems of milkweed, they didn't always look so great. They're kind of senescing early, or maybe they had been mowed over. But there were still substantially more in control than strip sites. What was remarkable is when she documented the number of monarch butterflies, the adults flying around, she consistently saw more at strip sites than control, and especially in August when she was seeing about 5 times more at strips than control sites. Now these are the adults, so these are flying around, and you might say, well, I thought monarchs need milkweed to reproduce. That's true, but the adults will feed on flowers from a variety of plants. And that's what I think we're seeing here, is that those prairie strips are offering them a buffet of a variety of plants, even when the milkweed isn't flowering. And monarchs need, the adults, need a nectar source for the fuel to get them both from Mexico into the rest of North America, but then also to come back down to Mexico when they migrate. And that's what we think is going on here, that they're finding these prairie strips and they're using them as a fueling station on their way back down south. So Caroline also looked at other bees, and she's in the process of identifying those. She's up to about 50 species right now. And she just shared with me some of the most common ones that she saw. Again, Melissoides bimaculata, one I talked about earlier that we found in corn and soybean fields. Lasioglossum dialictus, which is a group of bees in a genus that is very species rich, but very hard to identify. These bright metallic bees, like specifically Agapostomons virescens, and then a group in the family Halictus, specifically Halictus legatus, as you see here. And I don't mean to sound like an egghead and just use these scientific names, but I have to, because these aren't bees that we have common names for. They're not ones that we have a lot of experience working with, say like honeybees, where we've given them a common name. And I think this is a little bit unfortunate because it suggests that we haven't really looked deeply into these bees and thought more about what kind of services they provide us, such that we give them a common name instead of just relying on a scientific name. So now I want to transition a little bit to talk about one that we have given a common name to, and that's the honeybee. And I realize that the Liberty Prairie Foundation and the listeners may not be beekeepers, so you may not have an interest in this as a form of agriculture, but I want you to think about, as I report these results, that the honeybee allows us to do some really interesting experiments. When we're looking for wild bees, we don't control where they are, their densities, or we can't really measure a lot of intimate details of their health. But honeybees we can. They're easily movable, they're easily studied throughout the year. And this allows us to measure, at least for this one bee, how they're responding to a practice like prairie strips. So what you see here is Ge Zhang, recently minted PhD, who is in this one location looking at how these honeybees, there are 4 colonies, 4 stacks here, are responding to being in a grassy waterway, which is one of the control sites. So Gov put these out in June such that all the colonies were the same size. And then he goes back every other week to measure aspects of their health. One of the aspects that he measured was their population. So you see here, he's lifted up one of the frames from an individual colony, and he's estimating the population of bees on that frame. And this allows him to estimate the population for the entire colony. And what we found when we report this as a mean frame size of adult bees, so this is an estimate of adult honeybees, we started with populations all the same. He could do that intentionally. But after deploying those colonies to both control and strip sites, almost immediately we see greater populations for the colonies that were kept at a strip location. And that was throughout the year going into October. And this is especially important because in October, that's when the bees are getting ready to overwinter. And the larger the population at the overwintering time, the greater chance there is of success for them to survive the winter. Another thing that we measured was the weight of the colony. So putting that stack of bees, those boxes, onto a scale and measuring how heavy they are. And this is, again, was something we could control. So on the y-axis here is the average colony weight. We started with all the colonies being the same. And over time, as we got into July, colonies kept at the strip sites were heavier, to the point by August and into October, it was statistically so. By the end of the summer, it was about a 24% difference in weight. And this is important because by this point, August, late July into October, that weight is predominantly honey. So by reporting colony weight, we're estimating honey production, and we're getting a sense of how much more productive the bees could be if they were at a prairie site than a control. And I'll give you a visual version of the data that I'm showing here in this figure. This is a control site on August in 2019, and each one of these stacks represents an individual colony. And we started with just 1 box, but we had to add more as the colonies grew. And by August, they're each 3 what we call deeps high. This is a prairie strip site. Right, so we still have the same number of colonies, 4, but now we're 4 boxes high in each one. And each box, after the bottom one, where all the brood and the queen are, each one of these boxes above is where the honey is stored. And that represents about 25 pounds. So at about a 25-pound increase per colony per site, that can be a substantial amount of money for a beekeeper. And what's more important to beekeepers than honey is often the population, because that sets the contract price they can ask when renting out their colonies the next year, especially in the spring. One other thing I should point out, and this isn't work that we did, but some of our colleagues in the STRIPS project, Matt Liebman, Mary Harris, and Farnaz Kornbach, is that these prairie strips conserve things other than bees. In this picture is one of the insects that they studied. This is a ground beetle, specifically Pteristichus malinaris. Ground beetles are important because they're voracious weed seed predators. They'll also feed on other insects, but their contribution to weed seed predation is dramatic. And Farnaz and her colleagues measured the abundance and diversity of these at sites with and without prairie strips. I'll just show you a little bit of their data here. So the first set of bars represents the number of beetles per a 60-meter transect, where she would go out once a month and count them in both a control site, like a grass waterway, and then within the prairie strips. And you can see that she's getting over twice as many ground beetles at strips than control sites. And then the other pair here is the species richness, the number of species. So a little less remarkable difference, but still a difference nonetheless, about twice as many. And she's, within each bar, she's organized the community by whether they were common, uncommon, or rare. And so species like Pteristichus malinaris, which is a common one, really responding in terms of abundance. The rare ones, not so much, but uncommon ones did seem to respond strongly to the strips practice. So, to summarize, did prairie strips help? When we compare control site to a site where a farmer has put this into practice? Well, prairie strips increase the number of flowers, increase the diversity of flowering plants, increase the abundance of key pollinators like monarchs, and we're still looking at the response by wild bees as we go through those samples. And it increased the productivity of honeybees. And again, I know you're not beekeepers, but think in terms of what we can infer from that data. If honeybees are responding with an improved productivity, maybe the wild bees are as well. And finally, we see an increase in abundance of key natural enemies, like the crabbits and others as well, that I didn't have time to talk about. And I should point out that all of this increase was observed on commercial farms that were using herbicides and seed treatments. So these aren't organic farms where the farmers have stopped using pesticides. They continue to farm conventionally, but they're able to put these small patches of prairie in and see these results. So you might ask, how can I make this work on my farm? Let me take a step back. We're going to talk more about this with the rest of the webinar, and frankly, people better capable of describing this than me are going to take this on. Tim Youngquist and Omar Ducote-Mercader in a second. But I want to take a step back and think about sort of the general approach to reversing declines in pollinators and other environmental issues when it comes to farming. So our neighbors to the north, Minnesota, in 2017 passed what's called the Minnesota Buffer Law. This is a law that establishes that new perennial vegetation has to be around bodies of water like lakes, rivers, and streams. And we think about Minnesota, we think about the land of 10,000 lakes and a desire to preserve that resource. And so the Minnesota Buffer Law is what I like to think of as a top-down approach to conservation. It's the state government requiring farmers to adopt a practice. And I've been in Iowa for well over 15 years, and my sense of how Iowans would respond to this type of approach is depicted in this image. It's not that they're against it. Thank you, Nathan, for laughing. I don't often get giggles, but I appreciate it. And I don't mean to make light of Iowans or Iowa farmers. And to be fair, American Gothic is set in Iowa, and you can visit this house in southern Iowa. It exists. But I think it does capture sort of the response of people who are being told what to do. And that's not what the STRIPS project was about. The STRIPS project, starting in phase 1, was to share our results with the farming community, with landowners, and with other stakeholders. And when we invited them to events where we, like this, shared our results, or if we invited them to the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge and they saw this practice in place, this is the response that we got. An interest in adopting this practice for a farmer or landowner's own needs and interests. And this enters into phase 2, where now we're practicing research and demonstration on commercial farms, which is where I did the experiments with our students in the previous slide that I showed you. And this has been remarkable because now the landowners and farmers that have adopted this practice and got the prairie established are now sharing it with their communities. And this is a picture taken from last year when we could gather like this, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again in the future. And you can see the line of cars and people that are standing just at the edge of this prairie strip and the field in the background and listening to Justin Meekin, who works for the Tallgrass Prairie Center at University of Northern Iowa, talk about how the plant community is responding. But then we also ask the landowners and the farmers, what do they think? And at this event last year, I thought it was really interesting. The very first thing that the landowner said when we were sitting around was, I forgot, I got a little bit ahead of myself. But these field days are a representation of the 319 farmers that have put in place, as of July 2020, 1,700 acres of prairie that is pinpointed to protect acres above them to about 17,000. And talking about the landowner at this event, on his very first chance to talk to the group, he held up this jar. And that jar contains what beekeepers sometimes call a honey payment. You see, what happened was when he had the prairie established on his land, beekeepers found him out and asked if they could have permission to leave their colonies in or nearby his farm. And within the first year, they were reaping the rewards of this. And I found it interesting, his response, because he said, look, I can see the flowers and I can see the, plant community, but in my hand, I can hold the results of that. And it's an increase in productivity that he appreciated. And it's all of these results that I think have influenced the change in the recent Farm Bill. So prairie strips were included in the 2018 Farm Bill. And as a result, prairie strips have now been added to the Conservation Reserve Program, to CRP. And this is a program hopefully some of you know about or maybe even participate in. And this is a way that farmers can receive some federal support to help them adopt this practice. So if you have questions, hopefully I haven't gone too long. If you have questions about sort of the biology, ecology of this practice when it comes to beneficial insects, I'd be happy to answer them. But if you have questions about how this practice can be implemented, I think Tim and Omar are going to be better suited for that.
Well, let's go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Okay.
That's okay. I think I know.
That's fine. I'd like to give people a chance to ask you a few general questions before we get to Tim and Omar, if that's okay. So we do have the chat. We have a question from May. How does crop dusting impact the strips?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I can't answer that specifically because to date, none of the farms that we've worked on has used a crop dusting service. And by crop dusting, I think you mean an aerial application of a pesticide. And that's very common in Iowa to do that. But the farmers that we have worked with to date have not done that. I think that's, well, I don't know the exact reason why, but I suspect it's because the presence of the prairie strips, but also these farms are often located on sloping, hilly fields, which are a little bit tricky to spray with a crop duster to begin with. However, having told you that we haven't had crop dusting done on these fields, to the best of my knowledge, we have had farmers spray pesticides and occasionally an insecticide. And that has not substantially affected our results, or at least the results that I've shown you. Those typically are a single application of a pyrethroid, and we're made aware of it, and we do what we can to protect our colonies, but we've never lost a colony because of that, and we haven't seen a substantial reduction in the insect community in the prairie strip in which the field that was sprayed.
Got it. We also have two questions from Stephanie from Xerxes Society. One is about the sink source question. Can you update on research among the strips team that looks at how pesticides applied to crops may impact the plants, insects, other wildlife, soil, and groundwater in the strips? Has there been a comparison between strips in fields with conventional pesticide use and strips in fields with reduced pesticide use?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Let me start by picking up on the use of seed treatments. So we have looked at this specifically. As I told you, many of the farmers that participate in the strips project are using seed treatments. And we went to those fields and with help from a toxicologist here at Iowa State University, we asked, what is the concentration of neonicotinoids in the soil of a prairie strip that's at the base of a farm that's using them? What's the concentration in the soil? What's the concentration in flowering plant tissue? And then what's the concentration in the nectar and pollen of those plants that that have been foraged on by bees? So we went out and did a thing I called bee fishing. I give a little handheld vacuum cleaner to graduate students, and they vacuum suck the bees off of the flowering plants. And so now we can know, all right, is there neonic in the soil? Is it in the plant? And then is it actually in the pollen and nectar that the bees collect? And that is, that was also done over a 3-year period, and we're getting to the end of the analysis of those data. And what we've seen is that, yeah, we can find those products in the soil, in the plant tissue, and occasionally in the nectar and pollen. But the occurrence is very rare. It's not 100%, and it's typically limited to earlier in the season. And so I should point out that's a detection, right? That's just, we've measured the occurrence of it in those samples. Then when we measure the concentration, those concentrations are often 1 to 2 orders of magnitude below what would affect the bee on a lethal way. So I can't tell you that you can use these and it won't show up in the prairie strips. It will, but it does look like that use doesn't result in a concentration that's high enough to lethally affect them. There may be sublethal effects, but I should also point out that it doesn't always show up, that it's not a common occurrence. And I should also point out that, using seed treatments is in the power of the farmer, right? You can reduce that use, and as you back away from that, the occurrence would also decrease as well. So in terms of, I think this person asked about source sink dynamics, and I think there's a concern by some that if we plant these prairie strips, we're going to attract bees and then we're going to kill them with pesticides. I don't see evidence for that. Rather, what I see is we're planting this habitat and the bees are using it, especially late in the season, August, September, when in the surrounding landscape, there just aren't resources for them to use. And we're seeing a substantial increase in both diversity and abundance, and with the honeybee example, productivity.
Got the second question is, in your initial work observing the diversity of insects in soybeans, what was the expected source habitat? Where were those insects coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's another body of research that's somewhat independent of prairie strips.
Okay.
We really haven't looked deeply into how pests respond to the presence of prairie strips, other than to say we haven't seen pest abundance increase because of it. But with the soybean aphid, early on, before the prairie strips project started, we wanted to know if land use around a soybean field would affect the diversity and abundance of natural enemies. And what we found was it does. And specifically, lady beetles responded positively to land use diversity. And one specific one that was a real killer when it comes to soybean aphid is Harmonia axaritis, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. This is the one that gathers in our homes. It's kind of stinky, and in the fall, sometimes it nibbles on us. Some people think of it as a pest, but in soybean fields, it's a beast. And it responded really well, positively, to land use diversity, specifically trees and forested habitat. It likes to overwinter in forested habitats. It doesn't show up in prairie so much, and this gets a little inside baseball, and I'm kind of geeking out a little bit, and I'll stop. But I wanted to point out that Harmonia, that multicolored Asian lady beetle, is not native to North America. And I think that's partly why we don't see it so much in prairies, is that prairie is a native habitat. And I don't see an exotic lady beetle benefiting from a native habitat like prairie. Rather, it likes to overwinter in wooded habitats and in homes, places that mimic the native habitat of its home range, which is parts of Asia.
Got it. I think just for clarification, I think the question was, you had shown initial slides saying that even on soybean fields, you would find this diversity of native bees. And I think the question is, where were those native bees coming from? Where was their source?
Yeah. I misunderstood. Yeah, for the bee side. Yeah, that's a great question. I have been shocked at how much diversity is out there. The abundance isn't always great. Maybe it should be greater. But most of the bees that we capture in corn and soybean fields, and for that matter, prairies, are ground nesting bees. So they need the soil, an undisturbed part of the soil, to nest, to lay their eggs and develop their brood for next year. And so soil that is undisturbed is we think their home and their source. How much of that exists in Iowa? Well, enough that they persist. And I think there's some evidence from other systems that use reduced tillage that ground nesting bees respond positively to practices like reduced or no-till. Because again, that kind of makes sense, right? You don't disturb their home, and so they've got a nice refuge to survive.
Got it. So we have another question, which actually I think leads into Tim. Says, is there a specific preferred seed mix, etc.? So maybe would those questions be better for Tim? And the other question was, are burns used for these strip areas?
This is a great segue.
Yes. Yes,
yeah, because I think Tim is clearly more experienced in this than I. So Tim Youngquist is the farmer liaison for the Strips project, and Tim comes from a family farm in Kieran, Iowa, and he has substantial life and professional experience managing conservation areas. He worked in the AmeriCorps out on the West Coast and came back with that experience, has been trained at Iowa State, and now he helps us with farmers who are interested in putting prairie strips on their farms and making decisions like seed mixes, and then managing that habitat so it establishes, and then once it is established, keeping it. And that involves the question about burning and mowing. So Tim, are you you on?
Are you
Ready?
Yep, I'm here. You guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Tim,
do you have some slides you want to share?
I do, yeah, if we can get some screen sharing going.
Okay, I think I stopped screen sharing, so
I think you should be good.
Okay.
And I'm going to mute now and let Tim take over. Thanks, Tim.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right. Well, Matt, that was really interesting. It's always fun to hear other parts of the Strips team talk. We're a large interdisciplinary team. So Matt's heading up kind of some of the insect work, and to me that's just fascinating. I mean, I didn't know a whole lot about bees or insects when I started this job in 2014, and I've learned a lot about that through working with Matt and some of his colleagues. My specialty with the practice, I'm kind of what's called the farmer liaison. So I act as the pivot point between the researchers and the students here at Iowa State and the private farmers or landowners around the state of Iowa and beyond that have prairie strips or are interested. So I help with the seed mix, with the design, the implementation, the layout, and then some of the maintenance aspects afterward. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll get to some of those questions as we're going through here. And this is just going to be a little bit of an overview. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll send you some or share some resources that you can look at our website for some of the papers that Matt shared, and then upcoming webinars or different materials that you can use that are pretty resourceful. So just to show, as Matt mentioned, we started at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge back in 2007, and over a short period of time started to see really positive, what we call disproportionate benefits from just taking a small amount of the land and putting that in prairie. So having field days and doing a lot of extension and outreach, there's a lot of positives to having these online field days, but there's really no substitute for actually getting out in a field that has these prairie strips, listening to the insects, listening to the birds, looking at the beautiful diversity of flowering plants and blooming grasses. As we had some of these field days at the beginning part of the project, more and more people were coming to these field days and saying, well, how could I get something like this on my property? Is this something that would work outside of the Neil Smith Refuge and the initial site? So we got a little bit of an animation here that Omar put together that you'll hear from momentarily. This gives an idea of how things have spread. Is this not clear sure if it's working or not? So I can see it on my screen, but it looks like it's kind of just a blank screen for all of you.
Tim, I can see the map. Try hitting that pause button again. There you go.
Okay. Okay, well, the animation didn't work, but for whatever reason, I don't, yeah, not,
Give it some time, Tim. If you just hit that one more time, it runs a little bit slower. There's a bit of a delay.
okay. What you can see is both here in Iowa and then beyond, there's a nice smoothly animated, you can kind of see as the years are going on, and there's more and more dots that are showing up, and then more states that are being represented as time goes on. There's probably some inability to play this over the, let's see. Oh geez, now I really don't know what's happening. Hang on just a second, folks. Okay, but the thought being, since 2007, the strips team at Iowa State, we've worked with around 65 farmers, and we have, I think, 625 acres that are in Prairie, and that's protecting about 5,600 acres of row crop. So that's the folks that we've worked with, what we're calling partners or collaborators, that are privately owned farms all around the state, and then into Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri, and then kind of spreading Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky. We've had a lot of different inquiries from around. So we've got a lot of different landforms, a lot of different soil types, and then a lot of different private farms that this is not a laboratory. You know, these things are being just managed as there's a wide diversity, I guess, of how things are being managed. We have a few organic farms, but mostly corn and soybeans, and then, you know, regular herbicide application, some with full tillage. I mean, a lot of large equipment, just regular commercial farms. So this is where we're conducting what we're calling phase 2 of the research that we're kind of involved in now. We'll move ahead. With Prairie, we talked a little bit about the seed mix, or we had a question about that. Matt O'Neill mentioned Prairie would have been the dominant ground cover if you would have gone back about 150 years ago in both Illinois and in Iowa. This covered about 85% of the surface area of the state of Iowa. This would have been a mix of warm and cool season grasses, forbs, legumes, sedges, and rushes. So very much dominated by herbaceous species. There was a few woody, shrubby species, but very, very few trees. So this diversity of species persisted for thousands and thousands of years prior to European settlement of Iowa and of the Midwest. There's not necessarily an ideal seed mix, but the University of Northern Iowa's Tallgrass Prairie Center does have a lot of research about different seed mixes and how those can create different outcomes for prairie strips. So it depends a little bit on what your goals would be. If you're strictly just looking to limit erosion on your property, a mix that's maybe heavier with grasses and lower on the forbs or the flowering plants, you can really achieve a lot of good erosion control with a mix like that. If you're looking to have something more similar to that graph that Matt showed, where you have that buffet of blooming plants all throughout the season, a mix of 30 to 50 species that has some flowering plants, some legumes, and some forbs included, is going to give you that outcome. And then kind of having a mixed ratio of forbs and grasses is going to give you the best defense against weeds, weed pressure, tree pressure, things like that, and give you the best opportunity to have a somewhat more of a functioning ecosystem that's going to persist into the future. So this is a picture here of a first year prairie strip. These strips do require some maintenance. You know, they're really like a low maintenance thing, but it's not no maintenance. In the first 2 years, mowing is pretty critical because you have a lot of small seeded species that are going to be putting those deep roots down that Matt showed earlier, and not putting a lot of above ground growth. We have a good amount of moisture that falls out of the sky here, and we have a lot of weed pressure in ag settings. So you're going to have a lot of annual weeds that are trying to grow as quickly as possible and produce as much seed as possible. Through mowing prairie, research has found over the last several decades, you can really give that prairie a competitive advantage against those invasive weeds. So by mowing them off, preventing them from setting seed, giving the prairie the water, the nutrients, and the sunlight that it needs, you're really going to get more of those seeds that you planted are going to germinate, and they're going to grow successfully. So again, in the first couple of years, it's really not going to look much like prairie. Here you can see another prairie strip. This is still in the first year, but not much going on. Here's the importance of mowing. This is, again, research out of the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. On the left side of this ruler, you've got gray-headed coneflower, Ratibida pinnata. You can actually see one in the left-hand side of my slide. It's this yellow blooming plant, pretty common early successional species in prairie. And then on the right side of the ruler, you also have gray-headed coneflower, but that site was mowed. So you can see by not mowing your site, you are still going to have some of that species diversity, but you're stranding these species in just a dark forest where they're not getting the light they need. They're not going to get the nutrients that they need. So they're just very spindly and not going to be as likely to persist. Where on the right side, you have these incredibly thick, incredibly robust first-year plants.
Hey, Tim, we're seeing two pictures. We're seeing the main picture and the next slide. Is there a way of just showing the main slide?
You're in presenter view.
Oh, geez.
Close out of that and go just to regular view. So,
well, geez, thanks for telling me, guys.
I was trying to find a time to interrupt.
No, that's still presenter view, buddy. So down at the lower left-hand corner, the lower right-hand corner, keep going, keep going over, keep going.
Okay.
That one. Nope, that one. Oh, no, you got it. Still at presenter view.
You go to your display settings in the top left in the middle there, and you switch your screens. Swap presenter view and slideshow.
There you go.
All right. Well, what a mess here.
That's all right.
We're all good.
So you guys have been seeing the slide ahead. Anyway, mowing is important. Just that's about all you can say. When that vegetation gets to about the height of say mid calf or about 15 inches tall, you want to get out there and mow it down to about 4 to 6 inches in that first year. And then in the second year, you can mow less frequently. Again, it's depending a lot on how much moisture you get, how much growth you get on those plants. But in that second year, mowing to a height of about 10 inches is going to be kind of what you need to do. So you can see here in the second year, the plant community is changing. You're getting Canada wild rye, so you can see kind of the bushy foxtail looking grass, and then you've got some black-eyed Susan and some gray-headed coneflower. These are a couple different second-year strips. So you're getting some blooming, you're getting some floral resources for insects and things like that. But the neat thing is then in year 3, the prairie begins to mature, or it continues maturing, and this will go on for many years throughout the strips. But every year, you're just going to have more plants begin to express themselves, more things bloom. And by doing that maintenance mowing or establishment mowing in the first 2 years, that's how you're really going to achieve success and get your money's worth out of the plants that you put there. Then there was a question about burning. So beyond the third year, or even in the spring of the third year, if you can apply a prescribed fire to that strip, that's going to be really beneficial. Again, why any of this? As I mentioned, prairie was the dominant vegetation here for thousands of years. So these native species, bees and other insects, really are adapted for these particular species. They co-evolved with these flowers and with these grasses over a period of thousands of years. And again, the vegetation evolved with the application of fire. Both was heavily used by the Native Americans that were in this area, and then occasional lightning strikes throughout the summer and the spring and the fall. This is the closest management tool to a magic wand that you have with prairie. A good spring fire is a really great way to burn out woody vegetation, other trees and things that wouldn't normally be in a prairie. So that can be a great way to get those out. A lot of the annual weeds, many of the things that are from Europe and from Asia are just not adapted to the same fire regime that we have here. So fire can be a great way to invigorate the native plants and hold back some of the trees and the woody species. Just end my time here. I've dealt with a lot of farmers and landowners, and that's kind of one of the best parts of my job is I travel all around the state and then through kind of the Midwest in general, helping farmers and landowners get these prairie strips. And seeing is believing. You can sit here and kind of be watching your computer and thinking, well, I'm not really sure that I believe this or not, but I would highly encourage you to get out to one of these prairie strip sites that's in your area, or travel on over here to Iowa. Find a place where you can at least get out and take a look, because seeing is believing. And we've seen a lot of mentality change with these farmers. So once this is every year we do an evaluation that's sent out to all of our farmer collaborators, and they'll kind of anonymously send information back of what worked, what didn't work, what are some of the good things, what are some of the bad things. But here we've got, once established, they seem to have increased biodiversity, particularly birds and pollinators, cost effective compared to terraces, helped keeping the contours in place, aesthetically pleasing, easy to move equipment through compared to a terrace. Enjoying the beauty of the wildflowers, seeing lots of pollinators, providing a haven for pheasant population, which has grown substantially. Only had to mow it twice, was very pleased with the diversity of plants that are becoming established. However, my greatest satisfaction along with the no-till is I took a water sample. When the water was flowing out of the waterway, it was perfectly clear. Pride of seeing the progress of the prairie grasses and wildflowers established. Pride of having people in the local community notice and comment on its beauty. Personal pride in knowing it was helping out in some small way our water quality, and enjoying walking with my dog and getting up a few pheasants here and there. Oh, and by the way, seeing the songbirds flit in and out of the grasses. Our farm operator and his wife are very supportive of it. She loves the flowers and wants to plant some of the same species in her yard and on their other farms. And finally, the excitement of placing something new and beautiful on our farm that does work to help our soil. So to me, one of the most interesting parts, or the best parts about these prairie strips, in addition to all the benefits for the wildlife and for the soil and the nutrient movement, the water, all that, is truly just they're incredibly aesthetically pleasing. There are a lot of other cover crops and things that you can do for your farm, but by taking just a little bit of prairie, it's like, this is something you could put in your backyard. This is something you could do to a whole field. This is something that you could do to a part of the field, just by providing a little bit of habitat for these native species. You'll see all these benefits that we were talking about. I'd encourage you to dig a little deeper. We don't have much time here today, but check out our website. So prairiestrips.org. There's email that you can ask questions of either Omar or myself or any other member of the team. And then our social media on Twitter and Instagram, where you can find out about upcoming events or just look at some of the pictures or learn more about the research that we're doing. So that's about all I have. I probably went over my time, but you
did a great job. Let us just ask you a few questions, Tim, while we have you here. First of all, you did mention cost versus terraces and other options. Can you say something about what is the sort of average cost for a prairie strip?
Yeah, that can vary pretty widely, depending upon what species mix that you do. A lot of our strip sites have been about a 35 species mix, and there you're looking in the kind of $200 to $300 per acre range, and that would just be for the seed. But keeping in mind, if you're taking row crop land out of production, your largest cost is always going to be the opportunity cost foregone from taking that corn and soybean land out of production. So future revenue lost. That's where dovetail nicely into what Omar will be talking about, where the prairie strips are now in the CP43 or in the Conservation Reserve Program as a part of the Farm Bill, and you can get essentially on the order of 90% of the seed and establishment cost paid for, and then getting an annual rental payment that's very similar to whatever the county average is where you live, based on kind of the top 3 soil types. So very, very comparable, at least comparable to what a cash rent price would be if you'd be putting that in place on a farm.
Got it. And then in terms of, I guess, the practicality when you're working with a landowner or a landowner and a farmer, if you have like 1,000 acres or 500 acres, what's the design considerations as far as the placement of the exact location of the strip in terms of the watershed, natural areas, all those kinds of factors that might impact where the best site would be for the strip?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something we could do this again sometime. I could talk to you for a half a day about it.
That'd be awesome.
The biggest, most important thing to think about, or the place that I start all the time when I'm dealing with a new design or a new farmer or a new landowner, is the bottom of the watershed. Or think of like a micro watershed. Think of your field as a watershed. Where is the water leaving that property? And is there any areas, what you'd call concentrated flow, where maybe you have a waterway or some type of a gully that's forming, someplace that the water is going to be going through that area year after year after year? Maybe it's a problem all the time, has been for years, or you have to reshape it constantly. So taking and putting, either a half moon shape or some kind of a rectangle or whatever works with your equipment, putting something there to basically filter that water on the way out of the field, and then keep that soil, at least, even if it's not in place on the hill, keeping it from leaving your field. So keeping something there, that would be the biggest spot. Then working with, particularly when you talk about equipment, working with the planter and to some degree the sprayer. But if you're going to put infield strips, making them work in spacing that's going to be divisible by that equipment. So the planter would be the best place to start. If you could say put 200 feet between your strips, if you had say a 40-foot wide planter or something like that. I mean, that it's going to basically be 5 even passes between there. So you're creating uniform farming lanes. And even though you're putting something in the middle of the field, you're not creating any point rows or anything that's going to cause extra time to farm around. So there's a lot of considerations. That's a big question, but look at where the water's flowing through your property. And then secondarily would be look at, are there wet spots that are wet 8 out of 10 years? Are there, clay spots or steep hill slopes, things like that are not producing at the same level as the rest of the field? And by targeting those areas, again, it's a lot to get into, but you could increase your return on investment by taking some of those areas out and eliminating your inputs on those parts of the field.
That's excellent. Yeah, because I think most large farms have spots where they aren't that productive. And generally speaking, isn't the case that native plants don't need the rich soil to thrive?
Yeah, they actually will do a lot better. Many of the trees and the weed species are real nitrogen loving, and the prairie can really get by on a variety of different soils. They might not grow as tall, but less water, less nutrients, and the native species can do really well. So they're very adaptable to a wide range of soil types.
Excellent. So Tim, thank you so much. This was great. I think I would actually like to take you up on your invitation to have a session just on the practicalities of installing and maintaining prairie strips. So if you don't mind, I would love to set that up. That would be a great follow-up.
Yeah, so that'd be perfect. I appreciate it.
Matt, can you introduce Omar?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great.
We
So
can't see
maybe that's for the best. I got a face for radio. So Tim, great job as always. I want to introduce Omar Mercado to build on some of the topics that Tim introduced at the end. So Omar is our coordinator for communication, and he coordinates the transdisciplinary research and extension activities on the prairie strips and helping to expand upon the impacts for farmland, farm livelihood, soil and water, and wildlife conservation. He has been really instrumental at helping us translate our research and extension materials for the guidelines as part of the what I think Tim referred to as CP43, which is the exact practice that's in the Conservation Reserve Program that lines up with prairie strips. And so, Omar, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you build on what we've been talking about and hopefully give us some idea of some of the ways the CRP program could help Nathan and his group practice prairie strips.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, thanks for having us all here, Nathan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys all see me and hear me?
Yep. We're good.
All right, just give me 1 second here. All right, can you just see the slide?
Yes, it has a, yeah, there you go. Yep, all good.
Okay, great. So yeah, finishing up a longer presentation with policy. I kind of do the short straw in there because policy is usually pretty dry and kind of boring because it's policy and it's very clear cut on what needs to happen and how to implement a certain practice. So I have about 10 minutes to talk, so I opted to just show you guys some photographs of prairie strips sites as I just talk. And as Tim said, seeing is believing, and as adoption grows for this practice, we do get to see a lot of different examples of how this practice can be implemented on the landscape, which is exciting. And as Tim said, he could spend an entire day or longer just talking about implementation and design. But so my goal today is just kind of give you a really general overview of what the Conservation Reserve Program is, and just kind of talk about how you can access that as a financial resource to implement prairie strips on your farm. So the Conservation Reserve Program is a voluntary program for agricultural landowners. So through CRP, landowners can receive annual rental payments and cost share assistance to establish long-term resource conserving covers on eligible farmland. So prairie strips is now part of that, and it's one of the many options that farmers can choose as a conservation practice to implement on their farmlands. Other conservation practices that are common are like terraces and wetlands and riparian buffers or saturated buffers. There's a really long list, and I'm going to give you some resources at the end of my quick talk here on how to access all of those different practices. So how it works is that you get an annual rental payment based on the agricultural rental value of your land. And so you get cost share assistance for up to 50% to enroll a piece of land in CRP. And the contracts are about anywhere from 10 to 15 years long. And then there's always options for re-enrolling that land. So this is a poster I made to communicate all of the flexibility for the prairie strips practice in CRP. And these are the specific things that are required to be eligible to install this practice. So it's a minimum of 30 feet, a maximum of 120 feet, and up to 25% of a crop field. You can plant it around or through a field alongside waterways in a gradient level terrace. And this is a national practice, so we had to write the policy in such a way so that it could be applicable nationally. So we had to think about what prairie strips would look like in Hawaii. There's not prairie strips, prairie in Hawaii. So how do we take the principles of our research and apply it nationally? And so that's why we didn't require mostly or all native species, because seed markets are variable nationally. So that's why we have mostly native species. But each state is required to interpret the policy that best suits their state. So for Iowa, we're requiring all native species because our seed markets are more robust for perennials like prairie seeds. So here's, like I said, I'm just going to show you some pictures of prairie strips on the land. This is from our Armstrong research demonstration site over by Lewis. So CRP protects millions of acres of American land, and let's see, how do I want to not get too in the weeds here, but the whole point of the program is to improve natural resources, improve the condition of our water quality, and all the acreage that's enrolled in CRP is planted to permanent vegetative cover. This is a prairie strip site over in a very small town of 100 called Zwingle, Iowa, which is just south of Dubuque. The CRP is administered by the Farm Service Agency, but the technical support is provided by the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. And I'm gonna just break out of my screen here for 1 second, and I'm gonna show you how to find out where to find a USDA service center. But can you see the screen here?
We're seeing your PowerPoint again.
Okay, can you see this? Google?
Yep, I see Google.
Okay, so if you just go to Google and you type in USDA Service Center Locator, it's the first link, and you click that link, and it'll show you a map of the United States, and you click on your state. So I'm in Iowa, and I'm in Boone County. And then it'll give you the USDA service centers that you can access as a landowner in that county to start applications to get cost share. So can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep, all good.
Okay.
We're seeing the next slide too.
Okay. Let's see. How's that?
Same thing. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Okay. So when you go into USDA Service Center and you sign up for CRP, there's two different signups. There's a general sign up and a continuous sign up. And the general sign up is, that's a window of time that you have to go in and sign up the Prairie or your CRP program. And then there's a continuous sign up, which you can go in and enroll at any time of the year. And Prairie strips are under continuous sign up, and they're further incentivized under a different program called CLEAR, which is Clean Lakes, Estuaries, and Rivers. So you get extra incentive payments for signing up anything that the USDA decides they want to focus on. So in the 2018 Farm Bill, they wanted to focus on CLEAR practices. So Prairie strips got within that subset of practices, and those practices include saturated buffer, anything to do with water quality. So moving forward, this is an example of Prairie strip and corn. So to be eligible for CRP enrollment, as a landowner or a producer, you should have owned or operated the land for at least 12 months prior to the close of any CRP sign-up period. The new owner that acquires the land, there's some stipulations there with an owner's death and stuff, and that I'm not going to really talk about the nitty-gritty on land transfer, but basically the main thing you have to know is that it has to be agricultural land, and you have to have operated it for a minimum of 12 months to be eligible for any sort of CRP payment. So yeah, the land must either be cropland, including field margins. It needs to be planted into an agricultural commodity 4 of the previous 6 crop years. So even if you only owned it for 12 months, and you've just say taken Prairie out of production and farmed it for a year, that technically would not be eligible for CRP because it needs to be farmed for 4 to 6 years to be eligible. Marginal pasture land can be eligible as well. Let's see. So in talking about, what kind of cost share breakdown you get for these sort of practices, I kind of mentioned it briefly. The maximum annual rental payment in general signups is 85% of the National Ag Statistical Survey county average for that ag land, plus 50% cost share for establishment. So one way they can calculate that is based on a corn suitability rating, which is based on your soil type, and it's essentially predicting what yield that land can provide, and then the annual rental payment is based off of that. So we can't give blanket statements on how much money you would get for your annual rental payment, but our economist John Tyndall has a great publication that you can access on our homepage. So if you go to our homepage and go to how do I get started, there's a couple really great comprehensive extension publications that we've created that cover management and the cost of prairie strips. And the cost of prairie strips kind of outlines different types of seed mixes and different types of cost share, and what the ultimate cost would be if you implemented CRP with certain mixes. So depending on the context, CRP can be as cheap as $7 an acre. And then I'll show you another resource that you can access quickly online to kind of show you the breakdown of what you could potentially get for prairie strips under CRP. So this is a picture of a more diversified operation that has triticale in it. So that's triticale in the foreground, and then a prairie strip, and then corn. And that's next to the corn are grass waterways. So as you can see, it's a practice that can be broadly implemented in a varying degrees of complexity, which is great. So offers for CRP contracts are ranked according to something called the Environmental Benefits Index. So what the Farm Service Agency does is they collect data for each of the benefit factors based on the relative environmental benefits for the land offered. So each eligible offer is ranked in comparison to all other offers. So you're actually competing for cost share against other landowners. So one example would be an application that had a prairie buffer next to a sensitive water body would rank higher than a prairie strip in the middle of a crop field that's not anywhere near a water body. Because the whole point of CRP is to protect natural resources. So the more natural resources you protect, the more competitive your application is. So I'm just going to end on that. That's just a really super quick, dirty introduction to CRP. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and show you a resource, a couple of these resources that I had brought up. So our homepage is, can you see my screen?
No.
Okay, 1 second. Are you still seeing my PowerPoint?
Just seeing you.
Okay.
Which is fine.
Well, I should apologize for that. Let's see, I can't seem to pull up my Zoom window.
Well, what we could do is I'll be sending an email with all the resources that you, Tim, and Matt have shared. So maybe you could just share that with that, because we're
Okay.
close to 12:30.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we can do that.
I guess the thing that strikes me, I'd love to see any questions in the chat section, chat section. If you have any questions for Omar, and frankly for Tim and Matt too. I guess my question is, even in that brief overview, which is very helpful, it still sounds pretty complex. And one of the questions would be, are they going to welcome a farmland owner to come in and sort of, will they help guide them through that process? Are they pretty friendly?
Yes. So like I mentioned, every county in the United States has their own USDA service center, which is great because then the people that are working there are specialized in their own topography and their own natural resources. So you're not talking to a random person, you know, that lives in Hawaii and you're trying to implement prairie strips here in Iowa or Illinois. So every USDA service center in every county has natural resource and conservation professionals that can help you with applying for all the different programs. It's not just CRP. There's their environmental quality incentives program. There's a conservation stewardship program. There's the REAP, which is an environmental enhancement protection program. I don't know if that acronym is right. There's so many acronyms. That's another thing, is that there's a government speak and they love their acronyms. So the folks at the USDA Service Center will help you kind of navigate that language, because they do have their own language that they use for all this stuff. But
Okay.
the reason I'm pointing you all to the USDA Service Center is because that's kind of the hub to access all of the other cost share resources. So it's not just USDA resources. They also partner with the soil and water conservation districts. Sometimes they have Pheasant Forever personnel within their offices. They have watershed coordinators for state-run agricultural organizations. So in Iowa, we have IDALS, the Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. And then in Wisconsin, they have their own version of that, the Soil and Water Board. So it's nice to just go to one hub, and depending on what you want to do, they'll point you to the right direction for the right kind of cost share and provide you all the technical assistance that you need to achieve your goals.
Got it. Just as a note, everyone feel free to turn your video on. We're at sort of towards the end. We'd love to see everyone's face who's joined us. Feel free to share questions for anyone, any of the presenters now, so we can kind of get those out. One question I had, Omar, again, sort of just speaking about the specificity of this. From time that you apply and then it's ranked and competes against other proposals and then it actually gets approved, how long of a period is that normally?
That's hard to say. It depends on the experience of the staff in the office, but it's a longer process, maybe 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So ideally,
great.
if you want to sign something up, I would plan on having some time to invest in doing the paperwork.
Got it. Okay. So again, while I'm waiting for any other questions from anyone else, I'm curious, what are the biggest challenges? Like if someone's interested, but they're like, are there things that particularly are of concern or anxiety about farmland owners or farmers who are thinking about this that we haven't asked about yet? Omar, Tim, Matt, anybody?
Concerns from farmers about implementing conservation?
Like doing the strips, just doing the strips in general.
Yeah, I think the major barrier is just the management aspect of it. Wouldn't you say, Tim? Like thinking about, how to seed it and how to manage it in the long term and where to get the seed and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that part of it, just people not understanding, this ecosystem that used to be here, and we've kind of disconnected from it for about 150 years. So that's a big thing. And then any kind of infield structure, whether it's a terrace or a waterway or these prairie strips, anything that you're going to have to farm around, that can be one of the biggest challenges, because as we get smaller windows for planting or smaller windows for doing any kind of field operation, the folks that are farming lots and lots of ground, they don't want to have to spend a lot of extra time, farming around a particular infield structure, something like the herbicide drift that we touched on a little bit. I mean, just being extra cognizant about spraying around some of, an infield prairie strip. You might have to wait for a special day, or you might have to maybe even go back and spray it 2 different times just to avoid getting some direct drift onto that. So the education and then just kind of farming around them, those can be 2 of the things. But that's why I say try to get yourself out to one of these prairie strip sites, and you can see that we're really, it's not that much to put something like that out into the field, to put some prairie out there, and then the benefits that you're going to achieve are just going to far outweigh any of the negatives.
Okay. I know you're
one thing I was going to say really quickly that we may have not reiterated enough is that this is actually one of the cheaper conservation practices to implement out of a lot of other conservation practices.
Got it. I know you guys, I'm not sure if all 3 of you or some of you are going to be giving a webinar about strips for practical farmers of Iowa. I think that's coming up. Is that correct? About strips on rental land, is that correct?
Yep, that'll be the 29th of July here. So I think it'd be next Wednesday. I'll be doing that with the Practical Farmers of Iowa and then the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, talking about some of speaking to your farmer if you're a landowner and you've got a tenant farmer, and just kind of talking through some of those issues and some of the management things that we were talking about.
Got it. So I'm going to share a link to that when I send out the email as well. Can you give us a spoiler and give us one tip about farmland owners talking to their farmers about this?
Just like any kind of good relationship or good marriage or anything, communication, just getting them involved early in the process, not assuming that you're going to be necessarily right, and not assuming that their concerns aren't valid. So,
Sure.
Generally with the design process, what I'll design in my head, I would say never ends up being the final product. There's always a lot of back and forth, and just getting, whether it's a family business or your business partners or your local USDA office, just get as many of those stakeholders, involved at the very beginning. So everyone's aware of what's going on. Nobody has hurt feelings, anything like that. I mean, just keeping the communication. I know that sounds really basic, but that is really critical.
Excellent. So Matt, Tim, Omar, can you just give me one sentence, one closing thought about strips and farmland, especially for both farmland owners and farmers? Matt, why don't you start?
A little bit of conservation will go a long way.
Nice. Omar, any last sentence, encouragement or anything else?
Diversity is key to a resilient system.
Sweet. Tim?
You know, we've got some challenges with water quality and with erosion, but we know exactly what to do. You know, there's a lot of tools that are available out there for farmers and landowners. Prairie strips is just another one. So we know exactly what we need to do to solve the problem.
Awesome. Well, again, Matt, Tim, Omar, thank you so much for what you've done. It's great to see a university playing a leading role in developing innovation for conservation. That's awesome to see. And I will be sending out an email with the information that they've all shared, links and information that I think everyone will enjoy. Matt, I think it was Matt, I think you shared the image of American Gothic.
That's right.
Yeah. I hate to tell you this, but I grew up in a family where we had American Gothic over our dining room table. And I'm not sure how that shaped my psychology, but I'm not sure if it was all good.
Nathan, you're smiling, so that it's a good sign. And there are worse images to have in your house.
That's a good point. I didn't think about it that way. So again, thank you both.
There is someone that lives in that house and she makes amazing pie, just for the record.
Okay.
Nathan,
anyway, thank you.
Thank you and the Liberty Prairie Foundation for letting us share our stories. And yeah, if we can ever be of help in the future, let us know.
Wonderful. And thank you to our audience for participating and being interested in this. We will be having one more webinar next week, July 30th, Thursday. It's going to feature Paul Muggy from Iowa and Anna Crabtree-Jones from Villicus Farms in Montana, who farms, I think, 9,000 acres. They're both using prairie strips of various kinds. I think Paul, his first one he installed, I think 19 years ago or something. And I think this is going to be really interesting for everyone to see that. So I think that's it. And again, we're just grateful that you're interested. Thanks everyone for joining us and for your interest in thoughtful, generous farming. Have a great day.